Well, let's jump to the New Testament and look at some issues and some instances that are fun. Look on page 41. I'm going to give you the blanks before we look at these. Any businessmen or businesswomen in here? Yeah? What's the most important, three most important words in business? Location, location, location. Right? Well, it's very similar in biblical studies and theology. The three most important words, and they're right there in the blanks: context, context, context. And I always like to start this section off by looking at what would be the creme de la creme of contextual error. The biggest example in all of Christian history, well, maybe not all of Christian history, but all of the last 150 years of Christian history. Turn to Matthew chapter 24. This is an example that constantly and continually boggles my mind. That Christians, not just Christians in pews or in classrooms, but Christians from pulpits or on radio shows or on television continue to make. It absolutely boggles my mind. And every time I teach this, people in the class have the exact same reaction when we're done. They think, how could anybody see? Okay, so anyway, look at Matthew chapter 24, verses 40 and 41. And I would like somebody to just read Matthew 24, verses 40 and 41, please.
2 men will be in the field. One will be taken and the other left. 2 women will be grinding with a hand mill. One will be taken and the other left.
All right, what is that describing? Just, you don't have to look. Just, you read the books. What is it describing? The rapture. 2 will be in the field. 1 will be taken, 1 will be left. 2 will be at the hand mill. 1 will be taken, and 1 will be left. You don't want to be left. You want to be taken, because when the Lord comes, He's going to come down with a shout and a trumpet, and He's going to snatch the believers up, and we're going to be raptured with Him. And then 7 years, and an Antichrist and a beast comes up, and credit card chips are flying everywhere, and wars are going on, and all kinds of stuff that you read about in the books. There's only one problem. You don't read about them in one book, this book, because look at this passage now. I'm not going to talk about any Greek. There's not going to be any text critical issues to address. There's no variant translations involved in interpreting this. This is just an example of straight reading the passage in its context. So let's do that. Back up to verse 36, where this paragraph starts. Listen to Jesus' words. What he's talking about, I'm going to just do a little side note here. Some Christians think he's talking about his future return. Some Christians think he's talking about what's going to happen in 70 AD when Jerusalem falls. And some Christians think he's talking a little bit about both. Okay? So putting aside that whole thing, let's say for the sake of argument that he's talking about his return from heaven. That he's going to return. Alright? As it was in the days of Noah, so it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. For in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and given in marriage, until the day Noah boarded the ark. They didn't know what would happen until the flood came and took them all away. So this is how it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. 2 will be in the field, 1 will be taken and 1 left. 2 women will be grinding at the hand mill, 1 will be taken and 1 left. Therefore be alert, since you don't know what day your Lord is coming. He goes on to encourage and exhort them in that. Now, Jesus made a comparison. If you have a red letter Bible, it's in red letters. Jesus made a comparison. What did He compare the day or hour that no one knows about, which we'll call coming of Son of Man? Okay, and again, whether this is talking about 70 AD or sometime in the future or both, it doesn't matter. Jesus was describing the coming of the Son of Man. He says, it was just like what? Noah's days. Back in Genesis 6 through 9. Now, in Noah's day, according to Jesus, what were people doing? Eating, drinking, marrying, being given in marriage. They were just living life. They didn't know what would happen until what? The flood. And what does Jesus Himself say the flood did to them? Took them away. In Noah's day, the flood took them all away. So in Noah's day, who was left behind? Noah and his family. Noah was left, or left behind, and the flood is what did the taking of people. So then, if that's how it's going to be in the days of Noah, Jesus says that's how it's going to be in the days of the coming of the Son of Man. 2 will be in the field, 1 will be taken, and 1 will be left. Now, based on what Jesus just said, do you want to be one who's taken, or do you want to be one like Noah who's left? You want to be left behind. You want to be left. And the church read this passage this way for 1,850 years until John Nelson Darby and a few others came up with the idea, this is talking about a rapture, and read that meaning into this passage. Reading a meaning into the passage is called eisegesis. We mentioned that yesterday. That's not, you can't get that this passage is talking about anything other than being taken, means being taken away in God's judgment. And if you remember, every time Jesus talked about His return and coming and judging, think of the images He would use. He would say, the kingdom of heaven or the judgment day will be like someone who casts a net into the sea and pulls out all kinds of fishes and takes it on shore and separates and throws away the bad fish and keeps the good fish. Or let the wheat and the weeds grow together, and at the harvest the angels will come and they'll harvest them all. And they'll separate the wheat from the weeds, and they'll throw the weeds away to be burned, and they'll take the wheat and keep it in the Father's storehouse. Whenever Jesus talks about judgment and His return, what's going to happen is God's going to judge the earth by sweeping away in His judgment all evil and wickedness and everything that sets itself up against God. And what remains will be what survives as like a refiner's fire and remains with God in the new creations for eternity. What can't be shaken, what's sturdy, what's firm, what's built on the rock, which is Christ, that will remain. Everything else will be like chaff blown away in the wind or swept into the fire. So that's consistent interpretation of Jesus' teachings on the end and on judgment only by believing, first of all, that there's going to be this thing called the rapture, and you have to get that from another passage, and then reading this passage and saying, oh, that's what he must be talking about, and then ignoring the direct comparison that Jesus makes, can you come up with the idea of Left Behind, as in the book franchise? So, Left Behind, the books, they're bestsellers, people read them, a lot of you in here have probably read them, I'm sure, and they're fiction, and as long as you see that they're fiction and realize that from the opening page, the title page, they diverge from Scripture. Because you couldn't have a more on its head interpretation of Jesus' words here, that you don't want to be taken, that you want to be left, just like Noah and his family, to enjoy a renewed creation. Only by ignoring that could you come up with the idea that Jesus is saying you don't want to be left behind.
Do you believe there's going to be a rapture?
Yes and no. Do I believe there's going to be a Jesus coming and invisibly removing the church from this world before 7 years of awful tribulation and then before millennial kingdom? No. Do I believe that when Jesus comes and judges the world, His people are going to be caught up in the air to meet Him and welcome Him back as He comes in judgment and power? Yes. So if you're using rapture the way Christians for the first 1,850 years of the church have done, which is to describe the going up to meet Christ as He returns and celebrate His judgment on the world and our vindication, then yes, I believe in the rapture. But the idea of the rapture being where God takes His church out of the world is something that I would say you cannot find in Scripture unless you read the meaning into one passage in Paul in 1 Thessalonians 4. But now, faithful Christians have different positions on end times views. It should be noted, the position that's come to dominate evangelicals today, which is the dispensational, pre-tribulation, premillennial, mouthful, that view came about in the 1850s A young Scottish girl named Margaret MacDonald had a vision or a dream, and in it she said she saw a two-stage return of Christ. And she spoke about that, and one of the people who really caught on to that, John Nelson Darby, and sort of formalized that view, popularized that view, made it, fleshed it out. Then Cyrus Scofield was one who was taken with that view as well. He was a lawyer. He came up with the first study Bible in church history. Actually, I have it, the Scofield Reference Bible. This is the first study Bible. And in it, it was great because he had good cross-references and it had notes that explained a lot of things. But like with the other non-recommended study Bibles we talked about, you got Cyrus Scofield's theology as the study notes and subject headings, paragraph headings. One of the people who was won over to this view and who was really excited about it was Dwight Moody. And D.L. Moody was an amazing evangelist and led thousands and thousands of people to Christ, and was a proponent of this new view of the end times. And so throughout the late 1800s, and especially the early 1900s, this view spread. Bible colleges started popping up, started teaching this view. Some major ones were founded, Moody Bible Institute, Dallas Theological Seminary, and some others. And this idea, this dispensational premillennialism, it was an offshoot of historic premillennialism, which believed that the rapture that Paul talks about in 1 Thessalonians 4, will be caught up in the air, the church had always was describing Jesus as return, like his return to rule the world. Never before John Darby was it thought of as Jesus removing the church out of the world, like you see in the And so that view was popularized and circulated, and eventually it got a shot in the arm and great publicity with this little book that came out, The Late Great Planet Earth, by Hal Lindsey. A number of you here probably read it. And this capitalized on what was going on in the world at the time, especially once you had in 48, when Israel was established as a country. Many people saw that as a fulfillment of Ezekiel 36, Jeremiah 31, which we already looked at, and God gathering his people again, only they weren't. It was a secular democracy that had the name Israel, but people just read that as, this is the Israel of the Bible. And so that created this fervor in 48 and forward. And it's almost like the end times clock began ticking. Because that was supposed to be the sign. That was the sign that Moody and Scofield and Darby and others had said would happen before one generation before Jesus returns. So you got things like, well, a generation in the Bible is 40 years, Israel 48, therefore Jesus is coming back in 88. And you had the book that came out, 88 Reasons Why Christ Will Return in 1988, if anybody remembers that one. And that came and went, it happened, so you had to reevaluate. Well, it's not when Israel was founded, it's from when Israel gains control of all the land. So now you have Christians back in Israel fighting for the land so that they can gain control of it, so that Jesus can return. And the view permeates a lot of Christian thought and foreign policy, politics, and you get sometimes conflicting, but sometimes coinciding messages from preachers on television and different writers, John Hagee and David Jeremiah, Jack Van Impe and Pat Robertson. Pretty much if somebody sneezes in the Middle East, that's a sign Christ is coming back, because it fits into a chart or a timetable. And the king of charts would be the co-author left behind, Tim LaHaye, who came out with this book, Charting the End Times. And it's all charted out here. The whole Bible and its teaching on the end times are all charted out. Now, I've been to seminary. I can barely read this. But a lot of people look at something like this and they say, well, this is really detailed and it's very exhaustive and you'd have to be really smart to come up with this. And I agree with that. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's what the Bible teaches. There are a number of views that Christians have. And there are a number of views that the church as a whole, different church groups have always held to. And there's always been debate, and there always will be debate, because Jesus was so cryptic in his sayings. He spoke in apocalyptic of Matthew 24 and 25, and used symbols, he used Old Testament imagery. He gave us enough to keep us watchful, but not enough for us to make charts and dates and plan things out. And the church has differed on a number of ways of interpreting Revelation and end-time stuff, and it's a whole area of study. It's fascinating. The main thing that I wanted to just at least put forth is the view that's become dominant in American evangelicalism, which is through things like Great Planet Earth and Left Behind, is the view of dispensational premillennialism. And that's a view that is very new in the history of the church. In other words, it's a 150-year-old view. Now that doesn't mean anything's right or wrong, but when someone comes up with something that, or a group of people come up with a system of thinking or a system of interpretation that was unknown for the entire 1850 years preceding them, and people like John Wesley, John Calvin, Martin Luther, Athanasius, St. Augustine, all throughout church history have never known this or spoken this, and people who've studied the Bible, that's when I look at it and say, okay, wait a minute, the burden of proof needs to be on that view to prove itself from Scripture before we start signing up for websites that will take care of our pets when we're raptured away, which is a real thing. One of the things I've noticed is that, not all the time, but often people who I've spoken with who are the most passionate about their view of the end times often don't really have any awareness of how it developed. They just assume, well, it came from the Bible. It's in the Bible. The apostles taught it. The early church taught it. It's the Bible. And people are often surprised to realize it didn't come about for a long time. And it owes a lot more to world events in the 1850s than it does to what's in Scripture. Well, let's look at one more fun example from the world of evangelical Christianity. Let's look at number 6, snake handling. Has anybody ever seen or been around or read about Christians that pick up snakes? Yeah. Why do they, anybody know why they do that? If you turn to Mark chapter 16, Mark chapter 16 starting in verse 15. This is after Jesus appears to his disciples after his resurrection. Verse 14, he appears, he rebukes them for their unbelief. And then he says, "Go into all the world and preach the gospel to the whole creation. Whoever believes and is baptized will be saved, but whoever does not believe will be condemned. And these signs will accompany those who believe. In my name, they will drive out demons. They will speak in a new language. They will pick up snakes. If they should drink anything deadly, it will never harm them. They will lay hands on the sick, and they will get well." And then there's the ascension as Jesus leaves. So, from just a straightforward biblical standpoint, churches that practice the handling of serpents say, look, it's right here. Jesus says, this is what will accompany those who believe in me. And what's really interesting, and this actually, I had to tip my hat to the snake handler person who was in an interview. It was on a 2020 special. They asked and they said, well, what about the 5, 6, 7 people that died over the past number of years from snake bites in your congregation? And the elder of this church said, well, if you read the Bible, it doesn't say God will keep them from getting bit. It just says they'll pick them up. And he's right. It doesn't say they won't get bit. It just says they'll pick up snakes. But the question is, okay, is this passage telling us to pick up snakes? Well, some people would say, well, it's just describing what happened during the apostles' time. For instance, Paul was on the island of Malta after he was shipwrecked and he was building a fire. He reached into the bushes, a viper came out, bit him on the hand, and hung to it. He shook it off and walked away. He didn't die, and the locals there thought he was a god because he survived the snake bite. And so some would say this is just an illustration of what the early church did. But I think more important than that is we don't need to worry about it because this isn't in the Bible. And what I mean by that is back up to verse 9 of chapter 16. And you should have a footnote. You should have a footnote. I'm not sure if the Old King James notes it or the New King James, but every other translation has a footnote right at verse 9 all the way through the end of the chapter. And somebody read what your note says.
The most reliable early manuscripts and other ancient witnesses do not have Mark 16:9-20.
The most reliable manuscripts and early ancient witnesses do not have Mark 16:9-20. What that means is when New Testament scholars, the more manuscripts that were found, they started finding manuscripts of Mark, and one of the things that was missing from those manuscripts, from the earliest manuscripts, was this entire section beginning in verse 9. In other words, in the oldest copies we have of Mark's Gospel, he ends it at verse 8. And only after hundreds and hundreds of years do you start to see manuscripts of Mark's Gospel with the text of verses 9 through the end of the chapter on the end. And sometimes there's part of these verses in some manuscripts, and other manuscripts just have the first half of this section, but not the second. And so some of your study Bibles will even have a note that tells you the longer and the shorter ending of Mark's Gospel. If you have a Life Application Study Bible, it'll have it sectioned off and say the longer ending of Mark, the shorter ending of Mark, and it'll have a note that tells you where they appear in the ancient manuscripts. The point being that the translators in 1611 that worked on the King James and the translations from that, the manuscripts that they had of the New Testament all were from what's called the majority text, or the Textus Receptus is its official name in Latin. And this is the family of manuscripts that the King James translators used to translate the New Testament. They were the best manuscripts available to the translators at the time, and they all were late manuscripts from the medieval times that had this ending in it. But over the 500 years since the King James has been translated, as scholars have found more and more manuscripts that include Mark's Gospel, they don't have these passages. This section is missing. And so Christians, evangelical Christians, have taken basically two or three views of what this means. The first view says, no, these passages are original, and those early manuscripts are just missing them. They're deficient. The later manuscripts that the King James translators used are the ones that are accurate and preserve the original account. There's not really anything you can say to argue against that, because that's just a faith statement. I just choose to believe that these early manuscripts are wrong and these later ones are right. Some Christians argue that. Other Christians say, no, Mark, his gospel ended at verse 8. Because if you read Mark's Gospel, it's very fast-paced, it's very cut to the chase, get right to the point, and it is very early in the Christian tradition, so that Mark's Gospel circulated with apostles and followers of Jesus as they preached and proclaimed the good news. And Mark's Gospel is a perfect gospel to end on a cliffhanger, because it ends with the women being told, Jesus rose from the grave, now go wait for it. And it says the women went away afraid and didn't tell anybody. Now, obviously, they told somebody, and obviously Jesus appeared to the other apostles and all the stuff that we know from the other Gospels, because somebody wrote Mark and is preaching Mark. But Christians who aren't satisfied or don't see that as a fitting ending to Mark's Gospel, there's no resurrection, and the women leave the tomb afraid, and they don't accept the idea that Mark intentionally did that as a cliffhanger or as a way to basically turn the question then to the reader and say, the women went away and didn't say anything. What are you going to do now that you know Jesus is alive? Others have proposed, and good solid scholars have proposed, originally there was something else that Mark wrote, but we've lost it. Whether it was written on another papyrus that got lost, whether it was written and the scroll came to an end and he had to write it on another one and that one got lost, whether for whatever reason in the history of text transmission, Mark's original ending is lost to us. And they point to, and those Christians who take that position point to the fact that we've lost some of Paul's letters. In other words, Paul mentions letters in his writings that we don't have. He mentions a letter he wrote to the Corinthians before 1 Corinthians. We don't have that letter. So the idea that we don't have everything that every follower of Jesus ever wrote is not anything new. And some Christians will say, we just have to accept that for whatever reason, we don't have Mark's ending to his gospel, and we don't need to try to conjecture what it could be. But the dominant view as far as people that don't see 9 through the end as original to Mark's gospel what they do see it as is the practice among early scribes and early people transmitting and collecting these stories, that if you read Mark 9 through the end, Mark chapter 16, 9 through the end, that is a pretty good synopsis and summary of what you read in other parts of the Gospels and Paul's letters in the book of Acts. For instance, the picking up of the serpents is very much what happened to Paul. And laying hands on the sick is what happened with Peter and the other believers as the gospel was going forth. And the preaching and baptism and all of this stuff. So what they say is look at it and say, this is likely an early oral tradition or summary that a scribe or a copyist appended to the end of Mark's gospel when he was transmitting it to tell people, hey, the story didn't really end here. More stuff happened. The women didn't just leave afraid. But somehow, over the course of handing off and transmitting and copying, that addition or appendix or summary got incorporated or mistaken as part of the actual text. And so that's how you find it in later manuscripts, but not in earlier. To sum it up, what this means, what does this matter? Well, Mark 16, 9 through the end, my personal opinion is I think whatever it is, it was not original to Mark's gospel, whether it's an early summary or whatever it is. I'm not sure if there was a lost ending or if Mark meant to end it at 8. I'm comfortable with either way. I think both make sense. But whatever Mark 16, 9 through the end of the book is, it's not inspired scripture because it was not originally written by the author and not part of the original text. Therefore, we don't build doctrine on it. If it's not originally in Scripture, it's not authoritative for Christian faith and practice. So we can read it, look at it as a good example of the early church or what they were doing or however we want to look at it is fine, but it's not part of the text. And what you're seeing now is as the further and further we get away, and it's only taken half a millennium from the King James, the Standard Bible, the more you're starting to see Bible translations not as much afraid to put this as some do a whole separate section. The TNIV, for instance, when the NIV translators updated the NIV, they put the entire section in a paragraph down from the text in all italics in smaller print with an explanatory note saying what it was. And I think you're going to see that more and more, and eventually this will probably be this whole section relegated to a footnote at most, or at least separated from the text in some way so that the translators are telling you whatever this is, it's not originally part of Mark's gospel that he wrote. And so, therefore, the reason that snake handlers are in error is not because they pick up snakes and that's crazy. Christians do a lot of stuff that's crazy. The reason they're in error is because they're building and practicing a doctrine based on a text that was not part of the original scripture.
What was the answer to the blank there?
Oh, the blank. Sorry, yes. This is the importance of translation footnotes and text critical findings. The importance of translation footnotes. In other words, whatever Bible you use of any translation, these are the kinds of things that the footnotes are there to tell you. And they're very important. By the way, this is the biggest example in the entire New. In other words, of all the things that, for the skeptics to say, well, now I don't know if I can trust anything because in the New Testament they tell me this is in my Bible, but it wasn't originally there. Well, there are 3 examples that are major that involve passages that are in later manuscripts that aren't in the earliest. This is one. There's one in John 8, and there's one in 1 John chapter 5. And this is by far the biggest. And of those 3, no doctrine of the church is affected whatsoever.